It was May 1945. The war in Europe was dying, but it was not yet dead. Across the continent, towns still burned, soldiers still bled, and loyalties were dissolving into chaos. The Nazi Empire was collapsing from within, its leaders hiding or fleeing, its armies surrendering in fragments. But in one strange, forgotten corner of Austria, something happened that defied all logic. A story so unbelievable that it feels more like legend than fact. On a small hill in the Tyrolean Alps stood a medieval stone fortress called Castle Itter. It looked like something from an old fairy tale. Thick walls, towers piercing the mountain mist, surrounded by pine forests and winding roads. But during the last years of World War II, Castle Itter had become a prison, not for ordinary captives, but for some of the most valuable prisoners in all of Europe. Inside its cold stone halls, the Nazis held an unusual group: prominent French politicians, generals, and celebrities. Among them were former prime ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Renault, General Maurice Gamelin, Charles de Gaulle's sister, and even famous tennis star Jean Barotra. They were the political elite of pre-war France, men who had once ruled and shaped Europe. Now they were prisoners of the Reich, trophies for Hitler's propaganda machine. The SS guards at Itter were brutal, but by May 1945, even they knew the war was lost. Allied armies were closing in from the west, Soviet troops were advancing from the east. In the nearby valleys, German soldiers were deserting by the thousands. The air smelled of smoke and fear. The Third Reich was imploding. Inside the castle, the prisoners listened to distant artillery and wondered who would reach them first: the Americans, the Russians, or the fanatical SS units still loyal to Hitler, now roaming the countryside in chaos, killing anyone they considered a traitor. Then on May 4th, something unexpected happened. The SS guards abandoned the castle. They simply packed up and fled, leaving the prisoners confused, hungry, and terrified. The gate stood open, the radio silent. The men inside were free, but trapped. The war outside was still raging, and any Frenchman wandering the Austrian countryside could easily be shot as an enemy or spy. Among the prisoners was André Rougerie, a French resistance member who had survived Buchenwald. He later recalled the eerie silence that day. Quote, "The guards were gone, but we felt no joy. Freedom was only a word. Death could still find us on any road." Unquote. Desperate for help, the prisoners sent their Czech cook, Andreas Krobot, to find the nearest Allied forces. Krobot, armed with only a bicycle and courage, rode down the mountain and into the unknown. Every path was dangerous, patrolled by SS diehards who refused to surrender. But Krobot pedaled through the night, dodging checkpoints, until he reached the small town of Wurgl. There, he encountered something even stranger: German soldiers who had already rebelled against the SS. Their leader was Major Joseph Sepp Gong, a decorated officer of the Wehrmacht, the regular German army. Gong had fought on the Eastern Front, seen the horrors of war, and by 1945, he was done. He no longer believed in Hitler's cause. He had turned his weapons not against the Allies, but against the SS, to protect Austrian civilians from senseless bloodshed. When Krobot arrived breathless, explaining that a group of French VIPs were trapped in Castle Itter, Gong faced a choice that would define his legacy. He could walk away, the war was almost over and the SS still roamed the hills, but he made a decision that few soldiers in history have ever made. He would join forces with the enemy to fight a greater evil. Gong needed help. He couldn't take on an SS assault alone. So he drove toward the nearest American line under a white flag, hoping not to be shot on sight. His destination was the 23rd Tank Battalion of the 12th Armored Division, commanded by Captain J.C. X. Jack Lee Jr., a brash, cigar-chewing Texan with a reputation for guts and stubbornness. When the German major approached, Lee was immediately suspicious. After years of fighting the Wehrmacht, seeing one of them stroll up waving a truce flag seemed like a trick. But Gong wasn't bluffing. In broken English, he explained the situation. French VIPs, abandoned in a castle, about to be slaughtered by SS fanatics. Lee didn't hesitate. "All right, let's go get 'em," he said. What followed was one of the most bizarre alliances in modern warfare. American and German soldiers fighting side by side against the SS. That evening, Captain Lee assembled a small rescue team. Only 14 U.S. soldiers, one Sherman tank nicknamed Besotten Jenny, and a handful of Gong's Wehrmacht men, barely 10 in total. Together, fewer than 25 men set off towards Castle Itter, uncertain whether they'd find friend or foe waiting. As they drove through the winding mountain roads, the sense of unreality deepened. American GIs rode in the same trucks as German soldiers, men who days before might have killed each other without hesitation. Now they shared cigarettes and nervous jokes. Private Edward Szymanski later recalled, "It was like the world had flipped upside down. The Germans were helping us fight the SS. Nobody could believe it." When they reached the base of the hill leading to Castle Itter, the Americans were greeted by the Czech cook, waving frantically. The prisoners were still alive, but SS forces were gathering nearby. Lee's group moved fast, driving the Sherman tank through the castle gates just as darkness fell. Inside, the French prisoners couldn't believe their eyes. An American tank, a group of U.S. infantry, and German soldiers entering together? It made no sense. They cheered, embraced their rescuers, and finally felt hope. But it was short-lived. Scouts reported that hundreds of SS troops were moving towards the castle, heavily armed and eager for revenge. These were men who still obeyed Hitler's last orders, to fight to the death and kill all traitors. Lee realized they were completely surrounded. He had fewer than 25 men, a damaged tank, and a handful of rifles. But retreat was not an option. He looked at Gong, who nodded silently. For both men, the meaning of the war had changed. It was no longer about nations, but about humanity. As night fell, the defenders prepared for a siege. The French prisoners, including generals and politicians, grabbed weapons from the dead SS guards and manned the battlements themselves. Former prime ministers stood shoulder to shoulder with American privates and German soldiers, waiting for dawn. Down below, the SS gathered, hundreds strong. They knew who was inside, the most hated enemies of their Führer, and they were determined to wipe them out before the Allies arrived. On Sunday, May 5, 1945, the Battle of Castle Itter began, a battle unlike any other in history. The first shots rang out across the mountains, echoing through the valley. The Sherman tank fired from the courtyard, blasting through waves of SS attackers. Rifle fire cracked from the walls. Smoke filled the air as bullets ricocheted off the stone towers. Inside, the French prisoners fought bravely. General Gamelin, once commander of the entire French army, fired a carbine from the window like a common soldier. Paul Renault, who had once governed a nation, now loaded magazines for an American sergeant. Captain Lee shouted orders in English, Gong in German, both voices blending in the chaos. For a few surreal hours, nationalities didn't matter, only courage. As the battle raged, Gong spotted a sniper taking aim at a French prisoner and rushed into the open. A single bullet struck him in the head. The German major, who had betrayed the SS to save his enemies, fell dead beside the castle gate. When Lee saw him fall, he gritted his teeth and shouted, "Hold the line." They did. For hours, the defenders fought off waves of SS attackers. Outnumbered 10-1, they refused to yield. Every man, American, German, and French, knew that surrender meant massacre. By mid-afternoon, when their ammunition was nearly gone, they heard engines roaring in the distance. Reinforcements. American tanks from the 142nd Infantry Division had arrived. The SS, realizing they were trapped, broke and fled. When the smoke cleared, Castle Itter stood battered but unbroken. The defenders had won. The war officially ended the next day, May 6th. But on that mountain, the war's meaning had already changed forever. Because for one day, enemies became brothers. And together, they proved that humanity can survive even in the darkest war. The morning after Major Gangel made the extraordinary decision to fight alongside the Americans, the atmosphere at Castle Itter was surreal. The castle, centuries old and perched on its rocky hill, had never seen a day like this. Generals who had once commanded armies, politicians who had shaped nations, and soldiers from two formerly opposing armies now moved together, organizing defenses, checking weapons, and sharing the common bond of fear and determination. The German soldiers who had defied the SS were cautious but resolute. For them, this was not betrayal. It was survival, a moral imperative against a force that had long abandoned humanity. Captain Lee and his small American contingent surveyed the walls, counting their limited ammunition and calculating their meager manpower against the overwhelming force of the SS. The disparity was staggering. There were fewer than 25 defenders, including the French prisoners themselves, against hundreds of fanatic SS troops armed with rifles, machine guns, and mortars. And yet, for the first time in months of war, every man on those walls felt a sense of purpose that transcended nationality, politics, and personal history. They were united not by orders, not by flags, but by the simple human desire to protect life. Inside the castle, the French prisoners quickly adapted to their new roles. Men who had spent years debating policy and strategy now handled weapons with a combination of fear and determination. Paul Rednow, former prime minister, showed remarkable composure as he checked rifles and helped distribute ammunition. Edward Daladier moved along the battlements offering guidance and encouragement to younger men who had only known war as chaos. Jean Bourratreau, once a celebrated athlete, used his agility to help carry supplies up the narrow stairways, moving quickly through the halls, aware that any misstep could mean death. Meanwhile, the German defectors, led by Gangel, helped establish firing positions and coordinated with the Americans. They shared knowledge of SS tactics and possible avenues of attack, highlighting choke points and weak spots in the castle's defenses. Their presence was vital. Without them, the Americans and prisoners would have been forced to defend blindly against the disciplined, brutal, and desperate SS. Yet the psychological tension was enormous. Could they trust each other? Could the French prisoners believe that their former enemies genuinely wanted to protect them? History had taught caution, and the castle's stone walls echoed with that uneasy silence. The afternoon passed in preparation, a tense calm before the storm. Scouts were sent to the tree line, eyes straining through binoculars, attempting to gauge the movement of SS forces. Each distant crack of a rifle, each cloud of dust along a mountain path set hearts racing. Lieutenant Richard Fisk, one of the Americans, described the moment later. Quote, "We were all waiting for the inevitable, knowing the odds were stacked against us. But in that waiting, we felt alive, more alive than in any firefight I'd ever seen." End quote. As night fell, the first signals of the approaching SS became visible. Flames from torches flickered across the valley, and the sounds of marching boots echoed against the mountains. The defenders on the walls knew the attack would begin at first light. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. Every man, regardless of former allegiances, had to fight. The concept of war had shifted. It was no longer nationalistic pride or ideology. It was a fight for the survival of others, a testament to courage in the face of almost certain annihilation. That night, conversations unfolded quietly among the defenders. Private Szymanski spoke with a German corporal named Karl Weist, sharing stories of their childhoods, families, and lives before the war. It was surreal. Enemies speaking as friends, preparing to die together against a common foe. The castle itself seemed to absorb these stories, ancient walls bearing witness to the profound humanity emerging amid destruction. French prisoners, too, listened in disbelief, realizing that the soldiers who had once fought their nation were now risking everything to ensure their survival. At dawn, the first SS forces appeared on the ridge. They advanced in organized lines, fully armed, with a mixture of rage and desperation in their faces. They were die-hard loyalists, men who had chosen fanaticism over reason, obedience over morality. They had heard of the rebellion within the Wehrmacht and intended to crush it completely. They underestimated, however, the unity of the defenders within Castle Itter. The opening shots rang out like thunder across the valley. The Sherman tank, though lightly armored for its size, became the focal point of the defense. Its cannon roared, sending bullets into the advancing SS ranks. The walls of the castle, centuries old, held firm, offering strategic vantage points. French prisoners, once civilians, fired rifles and pistols, targeting officers and disruptors among the SS. The German defectors coordinated counterattacks, flanking positions, and setting traps along the gates. In the chaos, personal bravery emerged in the most extraordinary ways. One French general carried a wounded American soldier to safety under a hail of bullets. A German corporal dashed across the courtyard to throw a grenade into an approaching SS squad, sacrificing his own safety to protect the group. Every action was amplified by the sense of impossibility, the knowledge that the defenders were vastly outnumbered. As the battle continued, the castle itself became a character in this drama. Its towers offered strategic points for riflemen, its courtyards were arenas for desperate hand-to-hand combat, and its halls sheltered the wounded. Smoke from gunfire and grenades filled the air, mingling with the fog rolling down the mountains. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to stand still, compressing decades of fear, hatred, and courage into a single extraordinary episode. The SS attempted multiple frontal assaults, each repelled by the unlikely alliance. The Americans coordinated with the German soldiers, shouting over the chaos, calling out commands, and covering each other's blind spots. French prisoners provided critical intelligence, identifying which corridors and walls were weakest. Together, they function as a cohesive unit, an unprecedented collaboration of former enemies driven by necessity, morality, and sheer willpower. By midday, casualties began to mount, but morale remained remarkably high. Captain Lee encouraged the men relentlessly, his voice cutting through smoke and chaos. Quote, "Hold the line, every life counts. We're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for them." End quote. His words reminded every defender that they were part of something larger, something historical, something almost mythic. As the sun dipped toward evening, a particularly fierce assault threatened the castle's western gate. SS soldiers, having regrouped, charged with brutal precision. The Sherman tank opened fire, devastating their ranks, while French prisoners poured bullets from above. The Germans executed flanking maneuvers, attacking from multiple angles. It was hand-to-hand combat in some places, bullets and bayonets clashing, screams echoing through the castle corridors. Major Gangel, though mortally wounded in a previous engagement, remained the symbol of unity. Even as he staggered, he encouraged his men, gave directions to Americans, and reminded the French prisoners to hold fast. His presence inspired extraordinary courage. Later, survivors would recount how his calm authority, in the face of almost certain death, transformed fear into determination. By nightfall, the SS began to falter. Exhausted, demoralized, and under relentless fire from defenders who refused to retreat, their formations broke. One by one, they fell back into the valleys, disappearing into the forest. The defenders of Castle Itter, against all odds, had held their ground. The aftermath of the battle revealed the depth of this historical anomaly. 4 nations, France, Germany, the United States, and Austria, were represented in those few hundred yards of stone and earth. Citizens who had been prisoners, soldiers who had once fought each other, now shared the same story of survival, camaraderie, and courage. Castle Itter stood battered but unconquered, a monument to the possibility that, even in war, humanity could prevail. News of the battle slowly spread, astonishing military historians and journalists alike. How could enemies unite so seamlessly? How could French civilians, German defectors, and American soldiers coordinate and survive against a professional SS assault? The answers lay not in strategy alone, but in moral clarity. In that moment, they were not Americans or Germans or Frenchmen. They were simply human beings, defending life against fanaticism and cruelty. Yet even as the SS fled, the war outside was still very real. Castle Itter would soon be liberated formally by Allied forces. The broader conflict was ending, and Europe would begin to heal. But for those inside the walls, the battle had already changed the course of their lives, defining heroism not in terms of nationality, but in terms of courage, morality, and compassion. In the quiet hours after the battle, as survivors tended the wounded and counted the dead, they reflected on the surreal alliances formed that day. Captain Lee wrote in his journal that night, quote, "I fought against the Germans for years. I fired at them, been fired upon, and yet today they were my brothers. History will never believe it, but we fought together and survived because of it." End quote. And so part 2 closes with the defenders of Castle Itter exhausted, victorious, and forever changed. They had faced the impossible, fought together across former lines of enmity, and survived against overwhelming odds. But the story was far from over. Even as the SS retreated, questions remained. How had Major Gangel decided to switch sides? What was the mindset of the SS troops who nearly overran the castle? How did these events reflect the moral chaos and unexpected acts of heroism at the end of the Third Reich? The sun rose on May 5, 1945, casting pale light over the Tyrolean Alps, illuminating the ancient stones of Castle Itter. The air was crisp, yet heavy with smoke and anticipation. Inside the castle, the defenders readied themselves for what they knew would be the ultimate test. Captain Lee moved from window to window, checking lines of sight and ammunition, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the courtyard and the surrounding forest. Beside him, German soldiers whispered strategies in hushed tones, their former allegiance to Hitler now replaced with a singular mission: protect the prisoners at all costs. The French prisoners, despite their fear, were no longer passive. General Gamelin had taken up a rifle and moved among the battlements, giving orders and encouragement. Each man understood that survival depended on their unity, on their willingness to act as one despite their differences. There was no hierarchy here, only the shared recognition that life itself was on the line. Jean Boutrata, the tennis star, climbed a narrow spiral staircase to reinforce a weak point in the wall, moving with the agility that had once made him a champion. From the forest below came the first warnings of the SS advance. Scouts had reported movement, shadows creeping through trees, the glint of rifles in the morning sun. These were no ordinary soldiers, they were die-hard fanatics, trained to kill without hesitation, motivated by ideology and terror. And yet, the defenders were resolute. The knowledge that death was imminent sharpened their senses and hardened their resolve. As the first SS squad emerged from the tree line, the castle erupted in a symphony of battle. The Sherman tank, nicknamed Besatzungsjenne, fired its cannon, sending clouds of debris into the attackers. Rifle fire cracked from the battlements, bullets striking stone and flesh alike. The German defectors moved with precision, covering the Americans and French prisoners as they returned fire. Chaos reigned, yet there was method in the madness. Every man knew his role, and every shot counted. Major Gangel, though wounded in an earlier skirmish, refused to retreat. Blood stained his uniform, yet his eyes burned with determination. He positioned himself near a gate, ready to repel any direct assault. When a sniper took aim at one of the French prisoners, Gangel dove forward, intercepting the bullet intended for another. In that instant, he became more than a soldier. He became the symbol of the extraordinary courage that had united these men and women across former divides. Inside the castle, the corridors became corridors of heroism and horror. French prisoners moved swiftly, relaying ammunition, guiding wounded Americans, and holding positions along stairwells. Captain Lee coordinated with his men, shouting over the din of battle, his voice carrying authority and reassurance. Private Szymanski, a young soldier from Texas, found himself face-to-face with an SS officer in a narrow hallway. A shot rang out and the officer fell. Szymanski later recalled a surreal moment. It was like stepping through history, enemies, allies, all mixed together, fighting for something bigger than ourselves. Outside, the SS regrouped, bringing reinforcements to bear. Mortar rounds pounded the castle walls and machine gun fire cut through the morning mist. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing one of the most disciplined enemy units of the war. Yet their unity held firm. Each defender covered the other's blind spots, shared supplies, and encouraged the frightened older prisoners to hold fast. Even in the face of imminent death, morale remained unexpectedly high, a testament to the human spirit when confronted with the impossible. Hours passed in a blur of smoke, gunfire, and shouted commands. The castle itself seemed alive, groaning under the assault, yet holding firm against the waves of attackers. The defenders had prepared every corridor, every stairwell, and every battlement. Traps were set, ambushes planned, and fallback positions identified.
The SS may have been numerous, but the defenders knew the terrain intimately and used it to their advantage. As the day wore on, casualties began to mount. One German soldier was struck by rifle fire while covering an American's movement. A French prisoner was hit while carrying ammunition up a stairwell. Despite the losses, the defenders did not falter. Each casualty was mourned, honored, and replaced in duty. The castle became a crucible, forging an extraordinary unity from the disparate backgrounds of its defenders. By mid-afternoon, the SS attempted a concentrated assault on the western gate, the castle's most vulnerable point. They charged in waves, screaming, driven by fanaticism and desperation. The defenders met them with a combination of rifle fire, grenades, and sheer determination. The Sherman tank fired continuously, its cannon shaking the courtyard, while French prisoners manned the walls, picking off attackers with deadly accuracy. Every man fought with the awareness that surrender was not an option. Major Gongol, aware that his life hung by a thread, continued to direct the defense. His calm under fire inspired the others, and his knowledge of SS tactics allowed the defenders to anticipate attacks. Yet even he could not stop the inevitability of sacrifice. As another wave of attackers surged toward the gate, Gongol was struck in the head by a sniper's bullet, falling to the ground. His last orders had been to hold the castle at all costs. His death, though tragic, galvanized the defenders to fight with even greater determination. The battle raged into the evening. Smoke and dust hung in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder. The castle's walls bore the marks of relentless assault: pockmarked stones, splintered wood, and scorched metal. The defenders, exhausted and bloodied, held firm. Coordination between American and German soldiers remained critical, with each man covering the other's weaknesses and compensating for injuries. The French prisoners, though citizens by profession, became vital participants, carrying ammunition, tending the wounded, and manning firing positions. At dawn on May 6, 1945, the final assault began. The SS, determined to annihilate the defenders, pressed forward with renewed intensity. Waves of attackers surged toward the castle walls, only to be met with disciplined, coordinated fire. The Sherman tank roared repeatedly, its cannon tearing into advancing troops. Rifle fire from the battlements cut down attackers before they could reach the gates. Grenades and improvised explosives slowed the SS advance, buying precious time. The defenders maintained cohesion. Captain Lee's leadership was decisive, blending American tactics with the knowledge shared by the German defectors. Each man moved with purpose, covering allies, reinforcing weak points, and maintaining a defensive perimeter. The French prisoners, though citizens by profession, became vital participants, carrying ammunition, tending the wounded, and manning firing positions. Finally, reinforcements arrived. American units, alerted by earlier scouts and radio transmissions, reached Castle Itter in the afternoon. They reinforced the defenders, driving the remaining SS forces into retreat. The castle, battered but unbroken, had survived. Its defenders, a remarkable coalition of Americans, German defectors, and French prisoners, had achieved what seemed impossible: victory against overwhelming odds. The aftermath was surreal. Survivors tended the wounded, counted the dead, and shared stories of heroism, sacrifice, and courage. Major Gongol's death was mourned, yet his actions had ensured the survival of dozens of French VIPs. Captain Lee and his men were celebrated for their leadership, bravery, and strategic ingenuity. French prisoners expressed profound gratitude to both American and German soldiers, recognizing that their survival depended on an extraordinary alliance. Castle Itter, once a symbol of power and oppression, had become a monument to human courage, moral clarity, and unity. The battle challenged conventional understanding of warfare, illustrating that even in the darkest hours, humanity could emerge triumphant. The story of May 5th and 6th, 1945, would become one of the strangest and most remarkable episodes of World War II, a testament to the idea that enemies could become allies in the face of greater evil, and that courage and morality could transcend nationality, ideology, and history.
As the smoke cleared from Castle Itter, the valley below seemed eerily silent, almost holding its breath. The battle was over, the SS retreating into the forests, with their discipline broken and morale shattered. The defenders, though exhausted, alive, and bloodied, had achieved the impossible. French prisoners emerged from their hiding places, some trembling, others holding their wounds with stoic resolve. They had been saved, not by a single nation, but by the improbable alliance of Americans, German defectors, and their own determination. The castle, once a fortress of oppression, now symbolized resilience, morality, and unity in the most extraordinary circumstances of war. Captain Lee and his men, surveying the aftermath, felt a profound sense of awe. The walls were scarred with bullet holes, the ground littered with spent ammunition and broken equipment. Smoke still drifted from scorch marks where grenades had exploded, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Yet amid this destruction, the human spirit shone brighter than ever. The camaraderie forged between former enemies was tangible, a fragile yet unbreakable thread that had woven their survival together. French prisoners, many of them leaders, politicians, and dignitaries, moved through the castle, assisting the wounded and consoling the terrified. General Gamelin, his uniform tattered and bloodstained, addressed his fellow prisoners. "We have survived because they chose to stand with us, not as Germans or Americans, but as human beings. Never forget this day." His words captured the surreal nature of their survival, the extraordinary convergence of courage, loyalty, and moral choice. Major Gangel's death weighed heavily on everyone. Though his body had been carried from the battlefield, his legacy endured in every strategic decision that had saved the castle. The German defectors, many of whom had never imagined risking their lives for former enemies, mourned him quietly, their sorrow tempered by the knowledge that their actions had preserved countless lives. Gangel had become a symbol of moral courage, the embodiment of the belief that loyalty to humanity could surpass loyalty to ideology. As Allied reinforcements arrived, the defenders were formally relieved. The soldiers of the U.S. Army, fresh from the surrounding operations, entered the castle to provide assistance and medical aid. They were stunned to witness the coalition of defenders who had held off a superior SS force. Soldiers, historians, and journalists alike would later call Castle Itter a miracle, a convergence of circumstance, strategy, and moral clarity that defied the brutality of the wider conflict. Medical teams worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded, regardless of nationality. French prisoners, American soldiers, and German defectors were treated side by side, their suffering shared, their survival intertwined. The castle's halls became an impromptu hospital, echoing with the cries of pain, the murmurs of encouragement, and the quiet prayers of those who had faced death together. The experience blurred distinctions of nationality and rank, creating a shared narrative of endurance and compassion. As the days passed, the defenders reflected on the extraordinary events that had unfolded. Former adversaries shared stories, laughed nervously, and shed tears together. They recounted moments of bravery, the German corporal who sacrificed himself to save a French politician, the French athlete who carried ammunition under fire, the American tank crew that held off waves of SS soldiers. Each story was a testament to human resilience, to moral choice, and to the improbable alliances forged in the crucible of survival. The castle itself became a monument to this unique chapter of history. Its towers, walls, and courtyards bore the scars of battle, each mark a silent witness to the courage displayed within. Historians would later study the battle not just for military strategy, but for its moral and psychological significance. Castle Itter demonstrated that even in the final days of the Third Reich, where brutality and fanaticism dominated, human decency could still prevail against overwhelming odds. The surviving German defectors faced complicated fates. Many returned home, bearing the stigma of having fought against their former comrades, yet they carried with them the knowledge that their actions had saved lives. Captain Lee and his American soldiers continued their service, forever bonded by the shared experience of defending Castle Itter. The French prisoners, having witnessed the extraordinary courage of both Germans and Americans, would go on to serve their nation in the post-war era, carrying with them lessons of unity, moral clarity, and the profound strength of human cooperation. In the broader context of World War II, Castle Itter remained an anomaly. Battles were fought, territories conquered, and ideologies clashed across continents. Yet here, in a single valley in the Austrian Alps, the narrative of war had been rewritten. Victory was not achieved solely by weapons or strategy, but by an unwavering commitment to protect life, a willingness to defy orders in the service of morality, and the courage to stand together against a fanatical enemy. The psychological impact on all involved was profound. Soldiers who had spent years in combat, hardened by endless conflict, found a renewed sense of humanity. Prisoners who had endured fear and deprivation discovered courage and agency they thought lost. Historians and future generations would marvel at the moral complexity of Castle Itter, a story where former enemies became allies, where loyalty shifted from ideology to humanity, and where ordinary men performed extraordinary acts of heroism. Years later, interviews with survivors revealed a consistent theme. The battle had changed them irrevocably. French prisoners spoke of their gratitude and disbelief at the courage shown by those who had once been enemies. American soldiers recounted the unprecedented experience of coordinating with German defectors, learning lessons about trust, honor, and moral choice under fire. German soldiers reflected on the decision to defy the SS, understanding that their actions had not only saved lives, but had preserved their own sense of integrity in the midst of a collapsing regime. Castle Itter itself became a symbol, a testament to the unexpected alliances that can arise in the most extreme circumstances. The battle illustrated that war, while destructive and chaotic, could also reveal the profound capacities for courage, compassion, and moral clarity. It became a story passed down through military academies, history books, and documentaries, inspiring generations to consider the possibilities of ethical action even in the darkest hours of war. In reflecting on the battle, one cannot ignore the absurdity and unpredictability of history. A few hundred defenders, representing 3 different nations and multiple former allegiances, held off a superior SS force and saved prominent prisoners. They did so not because of overwhelming strength or technological advantage, but because of courage, quick thinking, and a moral imperative that transcended fear. The story challenges conventional narratives of war, showing that heroism can arise in unexpected forms and that unity, even among former enemies, can achieve the impossible. The legacy of Castle Itter extends beyond military history. It is a moral parable, a reminder that in times of great evil, ordinary individuals can make extraordinary choices. The defenders risked everything, not for glory, not for ideology, but for the preservation of life and the assertion of human decency. Their actions resonate as a beacon of hope, demonstrating that even amidst destruction, the human spirit can triumph through courage, empathy, and moral courage. And so, Castle Itter remains etched in history as a singular episode of World War II, a place where French prisoners, American soldiers, and German defectors fought side by side, where heroism defied convention, and where morality outweighed obedience to tyranny. It is a story of the improbable, the extraordinary, and the enduring power of human choice in the face of overwhelming adversity. As historians continue to study the battle, and as descendants of those involved recount the events, Castle Itter will forever be remembered not just as a site of military engagement, but as a monument to humanity, courage, and the extraordinary moral decisions that define us, even amidst the chaos of war.